the prisoners who saw the future, German POWs, and the collapse of the Nazi worldview. June 4, 1943. Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. At 10 o'clock that night, a train came to rest in a town few Americans had ever heard of, and even fewer Germans could have imagined. The doors opened. One by one, exhausted soldiers stepped down onto American soil, men who only weeks earlier had been fighting beneath the desert sun of North Africa. Among them was Unoffizier Burkhardt. Inside his jacket, hidden from guards and fellow prisoners alike, he carried a small diary. As he wrote, his hand shook, not from fear of punishment, but from something far more destabilizing. Doubt. Outside the station, electric lights burned in every direction. Farmhouses glowed in the distance. Streets were illuminated. Shop windows shone despite the late hour. Even isolated homes scattered across the Texas plains were lit as if energy itself were unlimited. For Burkhardt, this single image was enough to fracture the foundations of everything he had been taught. Germany had lived in darkness since 1940. Blackout regulations had turned cities into shadows. Rural electrification before the war had reached barely 20% of farms. Even before Allied bombers arrived, scarcity had shaped daily life. Yet here, according to Nazi propaganda, a decadent, racially mixed, economically collapsing America revealed itself not as weak, but radiant. Burkhardt wrote a sentence he knew would condemn him if discovered. The Americans must be lying. No nation could live like this while fighting a global war. But the evidence was not a speech, it was light. The defeat that preceded captivity. This moment in Texas did not begin the collapse, it merely confirmed it. The true rupture had occurred on May 13, 1943, in Tunisia. There, the Axis position in North Africa disintegrated entirely. General Eugen von Arnim, Rommel's successor, surrendered with what remained of the Afrika Korps. Between 250,000 and 275,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their arms. These were not raw recruits. They were veterans, men who had defeated British forces repeatedly, who had driven deep into Egypt, who had fought with skill and confidence. Their capture marked the largest mass surrender of German forces up to that point in the war. Among them was Feldwebel Hedemann Friedrich Radke, a decorated veteran of the French campaign in North Africa, wounded twice, holder of the Iron Cross First Class. Radke's diary, preserved decades later, would become one of the most valuable records of what followed, not because it described brutality, but because it documented disbelief. Oran, the first cracks. The prisoners were transported to Oran, Algeria, where makeshift camps held tens of thousands awaiting shipment. Even here, something felt wrong. The U.S. Army processed prisoners with an efficiency that unsettled German officers. Identification cards were issued and cataloged. Medical examinations were thorough. Inoculations were administered systematically. Most disturbing of all, their rights were explained in German. American officers spoke fluently, clearly, without hostility. They referenced the Geneva Convention not as a formality, but as an obligation. Then came the food. White bread, coffee, meat regularly. German soldiers initially assumed this was a temporary performance, a calculated display designed to impress or deceive. It took weeks before they understood a more unsettling truth. This was not special treatment. This was standard. The ships that should not exist. The Liberty ships that carried them across the Atlantic became the next stage of revelation. These vessels, functional, inelegant, mass-produced, were unlike anything in the German Navy. They were not symbols of prestige. They were tools, and there were thousands of them. The prisoners did not yet know that more than 2,700 Liberty ships would be built during the war, or that some were constructed in under 5 days. But they sensed something was wrong with the numbers. Ships that had delivered tanks, fuel, and ammunition to Europe now returned filled with prisoners instead of sailing empty. By summer 1943, As many as 30,000 Axis POWs were crossing the Atlantic each month. During the voyage, German soldiers watched American sailors discard food without ceremony. Not spoiled food, not ration scraps. Perfectly edible meals. Steaks half-eaten, bread untouched, milk poured away. Not once, every day. No speeches accompanied this waste. No gestures, no mockery, it simply happened because it could. For men who had counted calories in the desert and fought while malnourished, this was not just shocking. It was destabilizing. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Staubern, born into Prussian military traditions stretching back centuries, noticed something else. Radar equipment mounted openly on a cargo ship. Not a warship, a freighter. In that moment, he later wrote, he first suspected that the war was already lost, not tactically, but mathematically. Norfolk, the end of the myth. August 2, 1943. As the ships entered Norfolk Naval Base, the prisoners crowded the rails. What they saw exceeded every rumor. Docks stretched for miles. Cranes moved continuously. Ships were loaded and unloaded simultaneously in numbers impossible to count. The scale was industrial, not military. In one day, Norfolk handled more cargo than Hamburg could process in a week. Then came another detail, seemingly minor, but devastating. Parking lots. Hundreds of cars, belonging not to officers but to dockworkers. In Germany, automobile ownership was rare, even before the war. The Volkswagen had been promised for nearly a decade and never delivered. Here, laborers drove to work. The trains waiting for the prisoners were not freight wagons. They were passenger coaches, Pullman cars, padded seats, convertible sleeping berths, dining cars with white tablecloths. One guard apologized when the air conditioning malfunctioned. Air conditioning. The long ride west. The train journey to camps in Texas, Oklahoma, and the Midwest lasted days and proved more destructive to Nazi ideology than any Allied bombing campaign. Night after night, the prisoners watched America pass by. Every town was lit. Even small communities glowed with electricity. Shops were illuminated. Homes burned light in multiple rooms. Factories operated through the night, parking lots full at midnight. In Germany, entire cities lived in darkness. At rail stops, American workers performed tasks with speed and mechanization unknown in Europe. Coal was loaded automatically. Water pumped electrically. Systems operated smoothly, without smoke, shouting, or urgency. An electrical engineer among the prisoners calculated that a single rail yard consumed more power in 1 hour than his Berlin district used in a full day. The waste was not arrogance. It was normality. Factories without end, when scale became destiny. As the trains carried the prisoners westward, the American landscape transformed from surprise into certainty. In Tennessee, they passed aluminum plants that stretched for miles along the riverbanks. These were not isolated factories, but integrated industrial systems, electric furnaces consuming power on a scale that defied European understanding. One facility alone required more electricity than the entire city of Munich. German engineers aboard the trains fell silent. They did not need explanations. They recognized the numbers immediately. Near Louisville, Kentucky, the trains slowed beside the Rubbertown complex. Where empty fields had stood less than 2 years earlier, 4 massive synthetic rubber plants now operated continuously. Towers of steel rose above the landscape, distillation columns, catalytic crackers, cracking units, all unmistakably advanced. Germany had pioneered synthetic rubber chemistry. Yet even at its peak, it had never produced more than a fraction of what these plants generated annually. One former IG Farben chemist understood the implication instantly. This alone, he later recalled, meant the war was over. Tires, seals, hoses, everything mechanized warfare required were being produced here in quantities Germany could never match. Willow Run, the factory that ended the argument. Outside Detroit, the trains passed Willow Run. Even from a distance, the scale was impossible to ignore. The factory seemed less like a building and more like a city, windows stretching endlessly, smokestacks rising in ordered rows, rail spurs feeding into cavernous halls. Inside, unseen by the prisoners, but understood through rumor and observation, a bomber rolled off the line every 63 minutes. A B-24 Liberator. 42,000 workers. 1.5 million parts. More than 1,000 subcontractors. This single factory consumed more electricity than the entire German city of Cologne. For Luftwaffe prisoners who had been told American aircraft were crude and inferior, the realization was devastating. They could see the precision from the windows, the symmetry of assembly, the discipline of the line. These were not emergency machines. They were products of a system designed for permanence. Food as an industrial output. As the trains crossed the Mississippi River at St. Louis, the prisoners looked down upon barges carrying grain in quantities that strained comprehension. Grain elevators lined both banks, each capable of storing enough wheat to feed an entire German city for months. To men who had known rationing even before the war, this was not abundance. It was excess elevated to infrastructure. In Kansas City, stockyards stretched beyond the horizon. Tens of thousands of cattle waited calmly, fed by a system that treated meat not as a luxury, but as a staple. German soldiers watched American workers eat beef sandwiches during lunch breaks. Thick cuts of meat, white bread, cheese, vegetables. One guard purchased hamburgers for the prisoners, 20 of them, paid with $1. No ceremony, no hesitation. The prisoners did the math in silence. The camps, captivity without deprivation. When the trains finally arrived at their destinations, Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Iowa, the prisoners expected the conditions they had known elsewhere. Instead, they found something unprecedented. Camps constructed in mere months housed thousands in wooden barracks equipped with electricity, heating, and running water. Flush toilets, hot showers, proper drainage. For many prisoners, this exceeded their pre-war civilian living conditions. Camp hospitals were better equipped than most German municipal clinics. X-ray machines, surgical theaters, adequate anesthesia, pharmaceutical supplies that had vanished from Germany years earlier. Penicillin, still scarce even among German elites, was administered freely. American doctors worked alongside German physicians, sharing techniques without condescension. Mental trauma was treated, not punished. Breakdown was met with therapy, not beatings. To men shaped by authoritarian discipline, this approach was bewildering. The kitchens of plenty. The camp kitchens became another source of quiet shock. Industrial-scale stoves, walk-in refrigerators, automated mixers, dishwashing machines capable of serving thousands. Daily rations included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread. More disturbing than the quantity was the policy. American regulations required that meals be prepared in surplus, 10% more than necessary, to ensure no prisoner went hungry. The excess was discarded. Not because it was spoiled, because it was unnecessary. Former German chefs assigned to kitchen duty recorded throwing away more food in a day than their families had seen in years. Some cried as they did so. Labor without blindfolds. By late 1943, the American labor shortage led to a decision that would complete the ideological collapse. German prisoners were sent to work. Not behind walls. Not under blindfolds. But openly, across farms, mills, canneries, and processing plants. They traveled through the American countryside freely, guarded but unhidden. What they saw could not be unseen. In Texas, electrified cotton gins processed in hours what entire German villages managed in weeks. In Nebraska, sugar beet fields stretched farther than the eye could see, harvested by machines that replaced entire populations. A single combine harvester performed the labor of 100 men. American farmers spoke casually of yields double those of Germany's best land. For prisoners raised on blood and soil ideology, this was a devastating revelation. Prosperity came not from racial purity, but from machinery, infrastructure, and investment. Factories without whips. In food processing plants, German prisoners watched production lines run with minimal labor. Electric conveyors, automated fillers, steam cookers operating continuously. One elderly woman monitored a control panel that replaced 50 German workers. She drank coffee. She listened to the radio. She worked without fear. Near Detroit, prisoners unloading coal glimpsed the River Rouge complex, an industrial organism employing 100,000 workers. Parking lots filled with private cars. Not party elites. Workers. In Germany, even officers rarely owned vehicles. Here, labor is owned too. The quiet end of belief. By winter 1943, American intelligence officers noticed something unusual. The arguments had stopped. Fanatical Nazis grew silent. Requests for books increased. Prisoners asked for newspapers, multiple newspapers, so they could compare viewpoints. Camp newspapers edited by anti-Nazi prisoners gained readership. Articles debated democracy, economics, Reconstruction. This was not re-education through pressure. It was collapse through observation. When enemies were treated better than allies. In the autumn of 1943, German prisoners of war encountered a development they had not been prepared for, psychologically or ideologically. Italy surrendered. Under Nazi logic, betrayal demanded punishment. Yet what the German prisoners witnessed in American camps defied every assumption they had absorbed under the Reich. Italian prisoners who agreed to cooperate with U.S. authorities were reorganized into Italian service units. They were given better quarters, higher pay, increased freedom of movement, and civilian-style employment. They worked alongside American personnel, ate in American facilities, and in some cases were permitted limited interaction with civilian communities. German prisoners observed all of this in silence. In the Wehrmacht, Italians had been treated with contempt, useful but inferior. Here, the Americans extended dignity, opportunity, and trust to former enemies who had changed sides. One German prisoner wrote in his diary, "The Americans treat the Italians, who betrayed us, better than we ever treated them as allies. This democracy we were taught to despise appears more honorable than our own system." This was not political instruction. It was a moral comparison, and it was devastating. Christmas 1943, the final blow to the myth. Then came December. In Germany, the winter of 1943 was marked by hunger, cold, and destruction. Cities lay in ruins. Rations shrank further. Families struggled to survive. In American prison camps, something else happened. More than 500,000 Christmas packages arrived for German prisoners of war. They were not sent by the government. They came from churches, civic organizations, schools, and private families, from people who did not know the prisoners' names, from people whose sons were fighting and dying against German armies. The packages contained cigarettes, candy, toiletries, board games, and handwritten cards wishing peace and survival. At Camp Hearn in Texas, a local Methodist choir sang Christmas carols in German. Women from nearby towns sent homemade cakes and cookies. Boy Scouts delivered hand-drawn cards. This was not propaganda. It was unforced humanity. The Christmas meal itself bordered on the incomprehensible. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, and ice cream. Quantities of food unseen in Germany since before the First World War. Many prisoners ate until they were physically ill, not from hunger, but from shock. The guards explained calmly, this was not special treatment. This was a normal American Christmas dinner. Families across the country were eating the same meal. In that moment, the final remnants of Nazi racial ideology collapsed. Education instead of humiliation. By early 1944, American prison camps had quietly transformed into centers of education. More than 40,000 German prisoners enrolled voluntarily in educational programs. They studied English, American history, economics, mathematics, engineering, and political theory. Universities sent correspondence courses. Professors visited camps to lecture. Among them were Jewish refugees from Germany, men who had lost careers, homes, and families. They taught without bitterness. They spoke of democracy not as a slogan, but as a functioning system, of science as universal knowledge, not racial property, of criticism as a strength rather than a threat. Prisoners read multiple newspapers with opposing viewpoints. They debated openly, something impossible under the Nazi regime without fear of imprisonment or death. One prisoner wrote, "Here they criticize their own government openly. This does not weaken them. It makes them stronger." D-Day, the war ends in the mind. June 6, 1944. News of the Normandy invasion reached the camps within days. Soon after, prisoners were shown newsreels. What they saw erased any remaining illusions. 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, artificial harbors, endless supply lines delivering 15,000 tons of material per day across open beaches. This was not bravery alone. It was systems, logistics, production, and planning on a scale beyond anything Nazi Germany had ever conceived. One prisoner wrote, "We were not defeated by courage. We were defeated by capacity. We sent horses. They sent factories." From that point forward, the question was no longer whether Germany would lose, but how it had ever believed victory was possible. The final truth. In the spring of 1945, American authorities showed German prisoners footage of liberated concentration camps. Many refused to believe it. They claimed it was propaganda. Then letters arrived from Germany, then testimony from returning soldiers, then evidence that could no longer be denied. What collapsed was not only political belief, but moral identity. One former officer wrote, "We believed we were warriors for civilization. We discovered we were instruments of criminals." Military defeat became secondary. The true destruction was ethical. Returning home changed. Between 1945 and 1946, more than 370,000 German prisoners were repatriated from the United States. They returned to a Germany shattered physically, economically, and morally. But they did not return empty-handed. They carried knowledge. They had seen a society where prosperity came from productivity, not conquest, where workers were treated with dignity, where diversity strengthened output, where freedom created wealth. Many would later become diplomats, reformers, educators, and industrial leaders in West Germany. They applied what they had observed, not as ideology, but as practice.